Most people think they understand what's happening with Trump's new Bitcoin executive order. They believe it's just another regulatory update, another policy shift in a long line of political moves. But here's the uncomfortable truth. You're watching the early stages of a systemic realignment that will rewrite the incentives of the global financial system. And almost no one is talking about the side that truly matters. Let me start with a simple thought experiment. Imagine waking up tomorrow and discovering that the US government has quietly acquired strategic control over the world's most decentralized asset, not by owning it, but by shaping the rails it runs on. Imagine a world where Bitcoin isn't just a hedge against inflation, but a lever in America's geopolitical competition with China, a tool for capital surveillance, and a trigger that could accelerate or collapse global liquidity cycles in a matter of hours. Now, pair that with the math. $1.2 trillion in market cap, moving at the speed of code. Over 60% of global Bitcoin mining shifting across borders since 2021. Regulatory arbitrage emerging as the new battleground for digital power. You see the problem. A decentralized network now caught in a centralized struggle. The narrative you've been sold, innovation versus regulation, is too simple. The real story is about leverage, control, and the shifting architecture of monetary dominance. This executive order is not the main event. It's the first pressure test. So tonight, I'm going to break down the part no one else is willing to touch, the strategic intent behind the policy, the unintended consequences, and the opportunities hiding in the volatility ahead. Let's begin. Most people think Bitcoin is immune, that its decentralized architecture insulates it from governments, politicians, and bureaucratic whims. That assumption is dangerously naive. To understand what's happening with Trump's executive order, we need to step back and examine the tension between systemic decentralization and centralized authority. This isn't theory, it's a pattern repeated throughout history, a cycle of innovation, colliding with control that the unprepared always underestimate. Think about the early days of the internet. It was decentralized by design, a network of independent nodes, free-flowing data, resistant to control. Governments initially ignored it, and by the time they realized the power at stake, they were forced to adapt, often clumsily, with laws and regulations that shaped the network in ways the original architects never intended. Bitcoin sits at the same inflection point today, a network engineered to resist manipulation, now intersecting with the world's most sophisticated instruments of regulatory power. Let's frame this in concrete numbers. Bitcoin's market capitalization today exceeds $1.2 trillion, with transaction volume spiking past $50 billion daily on certain days. Mining power, once concentrated in small pockets of enthusiasts, now spans continents, with China's share plummeting from 65% to under 15% since 2021, as miners relocate to more favorable jurisdictions. This is not just financial movement, it's the redistribution of computational power, the physical manifestation of influence over a decentralized system. Every hash, every node, every transaction matters. It is leverage in the truest sense. Now imagine the implications when Washington issues an executive order targeting this ecosystem. It is not about stopping Bitcoin. That's impossible. Bitcoin is code, and code is inherently borderless. What the executive order is doing is much subtler and much more strategic. It's about shaping incentives, controlling the rails, and embedding leverage into the infrastructure that the network depends on. Think of it like installing subtle gravitational fields inside a zero-gravity system. You cannot stop the particles from moving, but you can bend their paths, constrain their trajectories, and ultimately predict where they must. Historically, centralized authorities have always sought to absorb or redirect emerging power structures. Consider the rise of financial derivatives in the late 20th century. Governments and major banks initially treated them as niche instruments. By the time the derivatives market reached $500 trillion in notional value, the regulatory framework was scrambling to catch up. Those who understood the mechanics early, the leverage, the counterparty exposure, the systemic interdependencies, were able to position themselves strategically. Those who ignored it were forced to react to consequences, often catastrophic ones. Bitcoin is at a similar crossroads, but this time, the stakes are global, instantaneous, and programmable. Let's take a thought experiment. Suppose a hypothetical regulatory mandate introduces a requirement for transparency in all cross-border Bitcoin settlements. On paper, it seems reasonable, anti-money laundering, tax compliance, but in practice, this introduces friction in a network designed to be pseudonymous, friction that slows transactions, that funnels liquidity through certain compliant channels, that makes certain miners and exchanges more influential than others. Suddenly, what was a free, borderless ecosystem becomes partially channeled through nodes, and actors the government can observe and, under certain circumstances, pressure. The decentralized network still exists, but its emergent behavior is subtly constrained. This is not speculation. This is first principles analysis of how incentives and system design interact with regulatory pressure. Another angle to consider, market psychology. Bitcoin thrives on trustlessness and perceived independence. Every executive announcement, every public policy signal sends ripples through the network's valuation, mining behavior, and investor confidence. Historically, we've seen similar dynamics with gold, oil, and foreign exchange reserves. When the US made moves to dominate the petrodollar system, nations realigned their reserves, hedged exposure, and ultimately influenced global trade patterns for decades. Bitcoin is now in a similar position, a new asset class, fluid, programmable, but entirely susceptible to strategic pressure if you control the rules around its integration into legacy finance. Let's not forget the operational mechanics. Mining, transaction verification, and exchange custody are not abstract. They require energy, hardware, and infrastructure. By regulating energy use, capital flows, and exchange operations, a government doesn't touch Bitcoin itself, but it touches everything that makes Bitcoin functional for the real world. Consider this: a miner with access to cheap, reliable energy can dominate hash power. An exchange compliant with local regulations becomes a hub for liquidity. Incentives shift, patterns emerge. Centralized oversight can indirectly reshape decentralized outcomes. That's the hidden power play. Now layer in international competition. Bitcoin is global, but every government has a comparative advantage in influencing certain components of the network. The United States controls major exchanges, regulatory standards, and financial conduits. China retains massive energy resources, specialized mining hardware, and deep technical expertise. Europe enforces compliance and tax transparency. Every executive order, every policy tweak, is effectively a move on this geopolitical chessboard. Decentralized networks may resist capture, but they cannot escape the rules imposed on the environment in which they operate. For those thinking this is all abstract, consider real-world consequences. If incentives are misaligned, miners may relocate en masse. Liquidity could fragment, exchanges may consolidate or fail, and investors may misprice risk, creating shocks reminiscent of the 2008 financial crisis but compressed into seconds, not years. And yet opportunities are embedded in these dynamics. Early actors who understand the intersection of policy, infrastructure, and network mechanics can anticipate flows, hedge exposure, and strategically deploy capital, not just to survive, but to thrive. Ultimately, the lesson here is simple but often ignored. Decentralization does not exist in a vacuum. Networks operate within ecosystems, and ecosystems are shaped by power, incentives, and constraints. Bitcoin is no exception. Trump's executive order is not a threat to Bitcoin itself. It's a probe, a stress test, a subtle reshaping of the environment. The implications are systemic, strategic, and immediate, and anyone ignoring them is already behind the curve. At first glance, an executive order on Bitcoin might look like a simple regulatory adjustment, a tweak to clarify compliance, taxation, or national security consideration. Most observers see it as bureaucratic housekeeping, but if you analyze it from a first principles perspective, it's much more than that. This is a calculated attempt to influence not just markets, but the underlying architecture of digital capital itself. To understand the stakes, you need to think like an engineer, a strategist, and a historian simultaneously. Start with the mechanics. Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies more broadly are protocols, software rules enforced by a network of distributed nodes. These rules are immutable in principle, but their real-world implementation relies on infrastructure, miners, exchanges, wallets, and liquidity channels. The executive order doesn't touch the code, but it touches every component that turns code into usable, transactable value. Consider it like controlling the shipping lines in a global economy. You may not own the factories, but if you control how goods move, you can shape outcomes. Data highlights the gravity of this leverage. Over 400,000 transactions occur daily on the Bitcoin network, representing tens of billions of dollars in value. The average confirmation time is about 10 minutes yet. The network's throughput is constrained by both protocol limits and real-world processing. Exchanges process the majority of transactions, and large mining pools collectively control over 60% of global hash power. By regulating these choke points, the financial rails and energy-intensive mining infrastructure, Washington can indirectly impose influence on a network designed to resist centralization. Historical patterns reinforce this dynamic. In 1971, when the United States abandoned the gold standard, the world did. Lose gold overnight. It lost the implicit stability that underpinned currency and trade. Systems adapted, but the new rules favored actors who understood the leverage points. In 2008, the financial collapse wasn't caused by a single bad loan. It was the result of incentives, opacity, and systemic interdependencies. Bitcoin operates on a global scale with transparency baked into the ledger, yet it is still subject to systemic pressures when the infrastructure supporting it becomes strategically constrained. Imagine a thought experiment. A policy mandates that all exchanges must report all incoming and outgoing Bitcoin transactions exceeding a certain threshold. On the surface, this appears as a compliance mechanism, but in practice, it funnels liquidity into specific, regulated conduits. It privileges compliant actors over decentralized ones, and over time, network behavior shifts. Nodes that were previously independent may migrate toward these hubs, and miners may relocate to jurisdictions that offer regulatory certainty or favorable incentives. The code hasn't changed, but the emergent behavior of the system has been fundamentally altered. This is the essence of control without touching the protocol itself. Consider capital flows. Bitcoin has evolved into a significant store of value, a hedge against inflation, and an instrument for international capital mobility. In 2025, roughly $300 billion in institutional assets are tied to cryptocurrency, derivatives, ETFs, and trusts. Executive actions that affect taxation, reporting, or custody indirectly alter risk pricing, liquidity, and market structure. Even subtle signals, statements from regulators, enforcement threats, or compliance guidelines can trigger capital movement on a massive scale. A shift in policy can move billions in minutes, creating both systemic risk and opportunity. The strategic implications are profound. Governments are learning to treat digital assets as levers for influence, not merely as financial instruments. By shaping access, enforcing compliance, and directing infrastructure deployment, Washington effectively acquires asymmetric influence over a decentralized network. This is why this executive order matters. It's not about halting innovation or punishing actors, it's about embedding leverage into the ecosystem itself. Historically, controlling infrastructure has always been more powerful than controlling the asset. The British Empire didn't dominate global trade by owning all goods, it controlled shipping, ports, and finance. Similarly, in 2025, whoever controls the critical intersections of Bitcoin exchanges, liquidity, hubs, mining pools, compliance channels, wields influence far beyond what the code alone would suggest. Decentralization provides resilience, but it cannot escape the environment in which it operates. Operational mechanics reinforce this dynamic. Mining requires energy and hardware. Exchanges require banking access and liquidity. Custodians require regulatory approval and insurance. By targeting these dependencies, Washington can subtly shift incentives. Miners may move to regions with cheaper energy or regulatory tolerance. Exchanges may consolidate under a handful of compliant operators, reducing network diversity. Investors may recalibrate risk models based on perceived government influence. Each ripple compounds, and what appears as a minor policy tweak can produce emergent systemic effects that are dramatic and rapid. We can also visualize this in a real-world scenario. Suppose a policy incentivizes miners to adopt certain energy standards or reporting practices. Mining power migrates accordingly. Liquidity becomes concentrated in compliant exchanges. Network congestion and transaction fees may spike temporarily as participants adjust. Institutional investors respond to predictable regulatory environments by reallocating capital. Retail investors react to volatility. Within weeks, the ecosystem looks very different, not because the code changed, but because the environment shaped behavior in a predictable, measurable way. This dynamic also introduces a new type of risk, centralization through incentives. Bitcoin's design assumes independent actors, but when financial, regulatory, and energy incentives align, a decentralized network can converge behaviorally without anyone issuing a direct command. This is subtle, but critical. A network that appears decentralized may, in practice, behave in ways that are easier to predict and influence. Systemic risk emerges not from the protocol, but from how humans respond to rules, incentives, and constraints. From a strategic perspective, the executive order is a signal. It communicates to domestic and international actors that digital capital is no longer an experimental frontier, it is a domain of strategic interest. Competitors will respond, markets will adjust, and the behavior of the network will evolve. For actors in the ecosystem, miners, investors, exchanges, technologists, understanding the interplay of code, capital, and policy is now as important as understanding the ledger itself. Strategic foresight becomes a competitive advantage. Finally, actionable insights emerge from first principles thinking. Analyze incentives, not intentions. Model infrastructure dependencies, not just price charts. Consider cross-border flows, energy availability, and regulatory arbitrage as variables in network behavior. Those who anticipate how policy reshapes incentives rather than reacting to headlines position themselves to manage risk and capture opportunity. The executive order is not a threat to be feared, it's a signal to be decoded. Those who understand the levers of influence can navigate, adapt, and potentially thrive in the new paradigm. What most people fail to see is that this executive order is not a minor regulatory adjustment. It's a signal that the rules of the game are shifting. History shows us that systems evolve faster than institutions can react, and those caught flat-footed pay the price. Bitcoin is code, yes, but it operates in a physical, financial, and geopolitical environment that is now being actively shaped by centralized power. Ignoring the incentives, infrastructure, dependencies, and emerging choke points is a strategic mistake. If you wait for clarity, opportunity will have passed. If you act without understanding, risk will overwhelm you. The path forward requires first principles thinking, analyze incentives, map dependencies, anticipate flows, and position decisively. The forces at play are real, measurable, and accelerating. This is not speculation, this is systemic inevitability. The question is simple. Are you prepared to navigate it? Or will you be swept aside by the currents you failed to see?